Okay, so we might make a start just because I know it's very late and very early in the morning for some people, and anyone else joining can just join as they come in. So first of all, thank you all for signing up and welcome to our webinar on taking your pharmacy degree overseas. So just the standard Zoom etiquette things, keeping yourself muted just so that we can hear the speaker and we don't have any background noise. If you have any questions, if you type a Q into the chat box, and then we will call on you to ask your question, or you're welcome to type it in. We are recording this session for anyone who's going to watch it later, who couldn't make it tonight. So if you would like to change your name to something anonymous, or you don't want your video on, you're obviously welcome to change that. Now, can everyone hear me? Is everyone okay technically? Fab. Okay, so first up we have Allan Edwards. So he is our pharmacist coming from Canada to New Zealand, and I will let him do the rest. Sorry, Allan, you are muted.
That's me. That's me on mute. First fault of Zoom meetings. Luckily, here in New Zealand, we didn't have to do too many Zoom meetings for very long. We were able to come to grips with COVID quite rapidly, so I was very happy to be living here. Again, an absolute pleasure and honor to be able to talk to all of you about my career history and how I ended up moving from the Northern Hemisphere down to the Southern Hemisphere. I will attempt to share my screen. So hopefully that's working. So this is my pharmacist tale of how I got to where I am. So as mentioned, I am from Canada. I grew up over on the East Coast in Nova Scotia and did my Bachelor of Science of Pharmacy degree in Halifax at Dalhousie University. I graduated in 1998. While I was doing my degree, I joined the Canadian Forces and was posted to various bases all across the country. I also had the opportunity to deploy 3 times overseas. The first time was in 1999. I went to Turkey with the Disaster Assistance Response Team, and that was in response to an earthquake that had decimated a large part of the northwestern part of Turkey. So we went in on 48 hours notice and set up a field hospital, and I treated between 400 and 500 patients a day for about 5 straight weeks through an interpreter. So that was quite an experience, especially for a fairly new pharmacist. And then I've done 2 tours overseas in Afghanistan as the clinical pharmacist in the multinational trauma hospital that was at Kandahar Airfield. After 12 years in the military, I left and settled down in Vancouver, where I did my Doctor of Pharmacy degree at the University of British Columbia. So for anybody not familiar, that was a post-grad degree and not a theses-based degree. It's entirely clinical. So it was 8 months of didactic training back in the classroom again, and then 12 one-month rotations with various specialists in a number of hospitals around the Vancouver area. So when I graduated from that in 2012, I didn't have any work commitments at the time of graduation, and my wife, who is a radiologist, was finishing up a locum contract. So we were both at the same point in our career with nothing sort of pressing on the horizon, and we talked about moving overseas for quite some time. So we finally saw the opportunity and moved across the world to beautiful New Zealand. And we knew a little bit about New Zealand. I had been here before, but I think a lot of what we knew came from the Lord of the Rings movies and hiking photos from friends and knowing that it was the birthplace of bungee jumping. So why else did we choose New Zealand? Well, Credentials for pharmacy are relatively easily transferable from Canada, also from the USA, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. A little more difficult for sure from countries outside of those areas. For myself, the healthcare system here is very similar to Canada, more of a socialist system. I could already speak the language, so that's always a bonus when you're starting a job in a career that's very language-based. It's part of the world that we would normally get to explore, so we thought it would be a really good opportunity for travel and exploration here. And like I said, I've been here before on a holiday, and I really, really liked it here. So how did we go about moving here? First thing I did was find a job. We decided we wanted to move to Christchurch. My wife had a work contact here who had told her in the past that if she wanted to come to Christchurch to work, they could probably find her a job. And I had really liked the area when I had been here on holiday. So I just went on the District Health Board career website, found a position that was vacant, contacted them. We did a Skype interview that went well. And then about a month later, they flew us down to Christchurch to do an in-person interview, and also to let us get a really good look around the city and the country to make sure that we wanted to move here. I think they had been burned a few times in the past on people who had moved here for work, decided that they didn't really like it, and then left after a couple of months, which was a fairly big expense, I think, for the hospital system here. So they gave us a good week here to look around, and it was good because it was only about 5 months after the second earthquake had ripped apart Christchurch. And this is what a lot of the city looked like when we got here. Buildings still waiting to be torn down, fences up everywhere. So we really had to think long and hard if that was something that we had wanted to move into, but we saw there was a lot of potential now in the city. And honestly, we kind of felt that it was probably one of the most earthquake safe cities in the world, since everything that was likely going to fall down had. So everything that was standing had proved itself to be earthquake safe. After finding a job, went through the process of applying for a visa here. Anybody who's thinking about moving to New Zealand, I would urge you to call them as opposed to going through their website. I find their website very difficult to use because it gives you a series of questions that lead you to what it thinks, the website that is, thinks is the most appropriate visa for you. And it may not actually be the best visa for your situation, but you don't really get a list that you can go through and pick and choose the visas that would interest you, that you think might be the most suitable. And there's not like a comparison chart on the website that you could look at. So certainly talking to an immigration officer will give you the best advice. Be prepared for the amount of documentation that they want. It is heaps and heaps and heaps, depending on the type of visa that you're doing. And if it's going to be a partner visa, for example, or a residency visa, they want proof of your relationship and criminal record checks. And it's just a lot to go through that'll take quite a few weeks to get together. So you just really have to be patient. And then after you submit everything, there's no rushing them. So again, you just need to be patient with the process, but it does come through. After that, I had to apply for my pharmacy practicing certificate here. Unlike the immigration website, the Pharmacy Council of New Zealand website is excellent. It's really well laid out, and it gives you step-by-step everything that you have to do. The first step was to pass the competency assessment of overseas pharmacist exam. And that's if, again, you're coming from either Canada, the US, Ireland, or the UK. So it's a pretty pricey exam to take. As you can see, it's over $3,000, and that's in Australian dollars. You have to sit it in person. They sit it in London, in New Zealand, and in Australia. I wrote it in London because it was an easier, cheaper flight and from Canada than coming down here. They only sit it 3 times a year. It is an open book exam, and honestly, it's really just a test of how well and how fast you can look stuff up in a book. They say that you can take in one of 3 books, either the British National Formulary, which I'm sure all of our UK friends here will be familiar with, or the Australia Pharmaceutical Formulary, the APF, or the Australian Medicines Handbook. This is the one that I bought. It's like $260, but it's the one I would recommend for anybody who was going to go through this, because all of the correct answers come out of this book word for word. And it's the kind of exam that you can't really answer most of the questions just based on your knowledge. I mean, I had just finished a pretty intensive doctorate, and I couldn't answer probably 90% of those questions without looking them up, just based on how they're written. It would be a question like, this drug X, pick the most common side effect, and it would list 5 side effects down the page, and they would all be potential side effects, but you had to find the one that was the most common, and really you needed to look that one up in the book, and they were all like that. There was also a bit where you had to do a calculations section, and another bit where you had to write a letter to a patient that you couldn't speak to in person about a new medication that they were starting. In my case, it was methotrexate, so that was a fairly long part. So it's time management and looking stuff up really, really fast. Honestly, though, really easy, because all of the answers will be right in front of you. After you get that out of the way, and that takes about a month to come back, you apply for registration. So that's $345 for the registration, and then another $800 after that for your practicing certificate, assuming that you're successful. You have to undergo a period of supervised practice, kind of like being an intern. 4 weeks if you're from the Ireland or UK, 3 months if you're from Canada or the USA. You have to pass a law and ethics interview, and that's so a face-to-face interview with another pharmacist, and they have a whole section of preset questions. Most places that you work at will have old examples that they can give you that you can go through. Honestly, that wasn't that bad. They're usually willing to talk you through things that might be a little bit gray, so that was good. And then if you're coming through from Canada or the USA, you have to do this revisit the workplace program, and that was like a work at home kind of workbook that was really, really long. I think my answers came out to about 70 pages long, and it wasn't hard. It was just a long process to get through. But again, it's just a relatively easy check in the box. Yeah, so after doing all that, about 3 and a bit months after I moved here, I was a fully licensed pharmacist. And how was it compared to Canada? Obviously, there are a lot of similarities and some differences. So similarities, it was mostly the same drugs and the same doses. So most of what I was familiar with was in front of me. The hospital hierarchy was the same. And by that, I mean, in hospital, there was mostly in terms of physicians, there were consultants, there were what they call registrars here. We would call them residents in Canada, and I think maybe the US, and house officers below that, which were kind of newly graduated doctors, and clinical interns, which are med students. So that was all very similar. Pharmacists here already had a clinical role, which is different than some countries that I know of. So that was familiar, and physicians here were very, very receptive to pharmacist input. You didn't have to fight to get your voice heard or to get your recommendations followed, which was nice. Some of the differences, though, they have a very restrictive formulary in the whole country. New Zealand has the cheapest medications out of any developed country. And to do that, they limit the number of medications that they actually license here. For example, when I got here, there was really only a couple of ACE inhibitors, and their preferred one is Cilazapro, which was not one that I was really familiar with using in Canada. So getting used to the dose equivalencies for certain medications compared to the Me Too's in that generic class that I would have been familiar with in Canada. Took a little bit of work. While they had clinical pharmacy practice here, I felt it was probably about 10 or 15 years behind Canada at the time. That being said, I've been here 8 years now, and it's easily caught up to Canada, and actually in some regards it's probably surpassed some areas of Canada anyway, not all provinces, but certainly some of them it has. So I did feel like I had stepped back a bit from what I was used to doing. But yeah, you sort of just, you know, learn the ropes as you go, and what you can and what you can't do. Some of the prescription abbreviations and shorthand is different here. I think it's probably more similar to the UK system in New Zealand, whereas Canada, I think, is very similar to the US for some of the abbreviations and shorthand that we use. The pharmacy education system here is quite a bit different from Canada. So not just the levels, but kind of what they learn and how they learn it. So some things they do better, some things not so much. So it took a little bit of time for me to kind of get used to what my colleagues had learned and what they knew and what their skill set was compared to mine, and what I could offer to pass on to them, and what they could then pass on to me that I certainly hadn't picked up in Canada. And the other thing that was really different here was the green pen. So I think that also might be a UK thing, and I can be corrected on that later, but pharmacists here were only allowed to document in any medical document, for example, the clinical notes or on the drug chart in green pen, or if it was in a note, if you didn't write the whole thing in green pen, you had to write pharmacist in green pen at the top so that everybody knew it was the pharmacist. That was certainly not something I had ever come across before in Canada. We just used, you know, black or blue pen, same as everybody else. So I thought that was kind of funny, but that was long-standing culture here. Other challenges that I had moving here, certainly the distance to family is tough. It's a 14-hour flight from Auckland, New Zealand to Vancouver. All my family's on the East Coast. That's another 6 to 7 hours flying with all the layovers. The quickest I can get home is about 26 hours. So that's hard. And the time difference can certainly be hard right now. It's an 11-hour time difference, or sorry, 9-hour time difference to my family. So yeah, makes just staying in touch a little bit hard. And that's been difficult, especially now when I can't really get home due to COVID. The cost to travel outside of the South Pacific is difficult. So we have friends in Europe, for example, that we want to visit, and it's really expensive and really long to get there from here. The first few years of living in a disaster zone in Christchurch was hard. Lots of road works, you know, so streets were closed all the time. Every time you went to work, you had to take a different route. When we first got here, there was like maybe a couple of restaurants, certainly no bars that were open or pubs, no malls really. So it was difficult kind of coming from Vancouver to that sort of a situation. But Christchurch is a city that's certainly punched above its weight, and they got interesting things built really, really quickly. They built an entire mall out of sea containers, for example, within the first couple of months, which was just really, really cool to see. And now the city is amazing. They've had such a great replan, rebuild design. Make less money here than I would in Canada, and the New Zealand dollar is worth less than the Canadian dollar, which when you're paying off student debt in Canada and you're making less and it's worth less is a bit of an issue, and it's something you have to think about if you're going to move here. And finally, driving on the wrong side of the road, and apologies to everybody who drives on the left side of the road in other countries, but that took a little bit of getting used to. Particularly intersections are tricky when you're not used to turning into the far lane when you're making a right turn, for example. And lastly, their pies have meat in them, and that's really weird when you come from Canada and all the pies are sweet pies like apple and blueberry and lemon meringue. So we were like, what kind of pies are these? And yeah, other than that, it's been a really great move for us. We've made really good friends. We've hiked every great walk in New Zealand. So we actually just got off a 5-day hike yesterday on the Old Ghost Road. So we've seen a number of the South Pacific Islands. We've made it over to Australia a number of times. It's been fantastic to learn a new system as similar as it is to Canada. It's just, it's different enough to keep it interesting. Like I said, practice here in terms of clinical pharmacy services has really exceeded growth compared to Canada for sure in the last few years. So they've already got pharmacist prescribers here, and that happened really quite rapidly. We're completely digital in hospital in terms of prescribing and clinical notes now. So everything's electronic, and that certainly isn't the case in most places in Canada. So yeah, it's been an exciting, cool place to move to. And I'm happy to take questions on my experience at the end of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Allan. You've done very well to adjust to meat in your pies and driving on what I would say is the correct side of the road. But
yes, you would.
You've done well. Now, so questions. Does anyone have any questions for Allan? Type a Q in the chat box if you do. There we go. So I've got a question from Ryan. Did you want to type it or unmute yourself?
I've unmuted myself.
Oh, sorry, to Ryan.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, scene. Do I have any regrets moving? No, actually, none at all. The adventure of living somewhere outside of Canada has been absolutely fantastic. We've had so many friends who have come to visit us here and have said, you know, we wish we had taken the opportunity when we had the chance to live somewhere overseas and have a bit of an adventure, but now they feel that they're tied down with either family or career, and are beyond being able to make that move. For us, we were relatively newly married. I think we'd only been married just about a year, I guess, when we moved here. So yeah, and it was great to have that adventure together early in our marriage. So no regrets.
We'll go to a question from Nicole Wood now. I think she might just be typing.
While we're waiting on Nicole, I see there is a question on what was the time frame to become fully qualified. So I applied. I had to do the application process for that competency exam for overseas pharmacists. I put that in July, and that actually takes a fair bit of documentation as well. They want a copy of your degree, your registration, a letter of good standing from your registration body. You actually have to have a senior first aid certificate to apply, which is I don't understand, but you need it. And then I went to London to write that in early September. I had the results back kind of mid-October. I started work in mid-October as well, and then it was really just the 3 months of supervised practice. And during that 3 months, I completed everything else that I needed to do, so the law and ethics exam and that revisit the workplace thing. So all told, I guess I put my first application in for the exam in August, and I was fully qualified by January. And certainly we had looked at moving to the UK at some point. We thought London would be pretty fun, but it looked like it was going to take me about 18 months to get fully licensed there as a pharmacist from Canada. So this was significantly quicker and easier.
And I think I saw Nicole, I think I saw that you were unmuting yourself and popping your video on. So would you like to go?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm on and I'm staying at like hospital flats and the internet's in New Zealand. And so you mentioned about some of the differences in the education system with pharmacy here versus pharmacy in Canada. Sort of those two programs.
Sorry, that was a little bit spotty in terms of, I don't know if it's my internet or yours, but I think you wanted to know like differences in the education program between Canada and, okay, perfect. So certainly the old program in Otago, which I understand has now just recently changed, there was a lot of focus on, I think, the chemistry part of pharmacy. So a lot on the medicinal chemistry and the drug structures. I think they were still doing flip charts on that. And we hadn't done that kind of thing in pharmacy in Canada in a long time. Even the Bachelor of Science program had kind of moved away from that in the mid-90s. Dalhousie University, where I did my BSc, the year after I started, so this would have been in '95, they moved to a completely kind of self-directed small group system that was very clinically focused, and all of the other universities sort of followed suit quickly after that, with a lot less of a focus on the chemistry bit of it, I think. Some of the other differences in Canada, if you want to have a career as a clinical pharmacist in hospital, you can go on and do a hospital residency, which is sort of like an internship year here, but again, much more clinically focused. So it was 12 months, and again, you did 12-month-long rotations through specialties in hospital with, I think we only did maybe 2 weeks of dispensary time total, and the rest of it was all clinical practice on the ward. So it was very, again, kind of clinically focused. And even then you had the ability in hospital to alter drug orders or stop orders independently of the physician. You, as a courtesy, you let them know what you did, but you had the ability to do that. And then we had the doctor of pharmacy degree as another stage in our clinical program, which wasn't available here. I know they have the certificate program here in clinical pharmacy, and so some advanced training, but again, not quite as clinically focused. In Canada now, there's no such thing as a Bachelor of Science degree in pharmacy. They've gone to all entry to practice doctor of pharmacy degrees. So regardless of what university you go to, you're going to come out as a doctor of pharmacy candidate. And it's 1 extra year now. I think it's a 5-year program instead of a 4-year program.
All right, we might take one last question from Dylan, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. And I think Allan said you were going to stay on, and people might be able to ask questions at the end.
Yes, yeah, I'll hang around.
Perfect. So Dylan, did you want to type? Oh, there we go.
So I was employed, actually. So I had taken a short-term position as the emergency department pharmacist at the Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster, which is just outside of Vancouver, and doing kind of a lot of the other stuff either in the evenings or on the weekends in terms of getting all of the paperwork together for visas and registration. And then the other thing I did was get a copy of that Australian Medicines Handbook and read through that and put those little sticky flags on every single page that looked like it might be useful, which you're allowed to do. You're not allowed to write notes in the book, but you can flag it to death if you want. I probably had about 60 flags sticking into this thing. So yeah, I was working.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I think we might move on to our next speaker now. So Elizabeth Doran. So she is our UK to Australia, our Yorkie abroad. So I will let her tell us her tale. Yeah. Elizabeth, are you on? She was on just a second ago, but I might just inquire as to where she is. One moment, guys. We might get Kimberley. Were you happy to present now while we just try and figure out what's happened to Elizabeth?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Yeah, perfect. So Kimberley Trew-Smith. So she is our New Zealand.
Oh,
You are here?
I am sorry, my internet keeps dropping out. Sorry, my love.
No, that's okay.
Sorry, Kimberley.
No problem.
Just go to bed.
Perfect. So if you wanted to start sharing your screen and start whenever.
Yeah. Okay, let's see how this goes. I'll give you this one. So hopefully this works out. I asked it to do slideshow, so we'll see if that does that. There we go. All right, so everyone can see that. Okay, so thanks for the invitation, Ella. That was kind of you to get in touch. So I thank Allan, who's covered quite a lot of what I have to talk about anyway, because the system between transferring between to the New Zealand is obviously stolen, as you can see, from the Australian system. So that makes life a bit easier for me. But I want to talk about obviously moving from the UK to Australia. Currently, I work in the emergency department at the Royal Brisbane here and have done for the last 13 years. But you can tell that obviously I'm from Yorkshire originally, which is that top left-hand corner. And I left that beautiful scenery behind to come and work basically somewhere that was just a bit warmer and a bit more by the beach, I guess. So in terms of disclosures, I don't have any. This is my personal opinion, so I don't want to get into trouble with my boss. And it's worth pointing out that I have very little professional experience of community pharmacy, either here or in Australia, or in the UK actually. So most of what I'm going to talk about is based on my experience from hospital pharmacy, and particularly in Australia, it's going to be based about my time in Queensland. Although because I do work sort of at a national level with our Hospital Pharmacists Association, I obviously have some insight into other states and territories. But probably the most important disclosure from, as far as I'm concerned, is that despite having been a citizen of Australia for the last 6 years, I very much regard myself still to be British. And that always comes out evident when it comes to any kind of sporting competition. And Eurovision now, which is a bit weird. Okay, so how did I get here? So I graduated from the University of Nottingham in 2002, and I graduated with a 2-1, which is apparently reasonable enough, just enough education to perform. And whilst I was at Nottingham, I was really heavily involved in the British Pharmaceutical Students Association, where I spent a number of years on the executive committee there, and actually finished up by being the association president in 2003, I think. And what BPSA sort of taught me was it gave me insight into different aspects of pharmacy that I wasn't necessarily aware of. Obviously, I had exposure to things like IPSF and NAPSA, and that really opened my eyes to what was available, both internationally, but also in terms of what doors were open within the profession itself and how I could contribute to the profession, and also how I could work together really to see what I wanted to achieve there. And as part of my hospital placements, I kind of realised that I wanted to be a hospital pharmacist, and so I went straight from graduation into a pre-reg year at Norfolk Park in St Mark's, which is in outer West London, and did my pre-reg year there before I moved up to Sheffield in the north of England again, where I did my residency, which was pretty common then really in the UK, and it's definitely reflecting what Allan's just said. It's definitely the way that it's going, and it's certainly taking off in Australia as well. But when I came to Australia, it wasn't a very common thing to do a residency, but certainly it helped me when I was in the UK to having done that somewhere as busy as Sheffield in particular. Whilst I was on my residency, I did my clinical diploma through the University of Bradford, which is that attractive sort of pink globe on the left-hand side there. From there on, went to work in Southampton on the south coast of England, where I was a band 7 pharmacist in the medicines information department there, and had a really good time, just kind of working at that level with various different clinicians and really having a really good experience as professionally and personally at the same time. And that's where I also got more involved in the UK CPA. So you can see I'm obviously a joiner in terms of my personality type. But that really kind of gave me that leaning that that networks are really important, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But whilst I was in Southampton, I met an Australian pharmacist. So unlike Allan, I moved to follow someone as opposed to moving with somebody. And his visa was going to expire in the UK. So he came back to Australia and I came over not long after, having done a reasonable amount of my competency assessment and registration whilst I was in the UK to an extent. So I've been working in Brisbane ever since, and I'm now working in the emergency department where I've been working for a few years. And the reason why I mention that is because a lot of the skills that I have that I got, particularly around business planning and things like that, which sounds really boring, I probably got from having that extra level of insight from working in the NHS, and also sort of that organisational awareness from working with in associations like UK CPA and the BPSA. And then whilst I've been here, I've done some further study again. So I've done a toxicology diploma, which is obviously very helpful in emergency. But I had to do that through the University of Cardiff because no similar courses in Australia are open to non-medics, which is a massive issue, I think. Not in the least in the fact that I had a bizarre situation of being a British person applying as a foreign student to a British university and then having to prove that I could speak English, which was a bit bizarre. But that in itself was quite an experience because it obviously showed what gaps are here and where you have to go to get into certain niches or specialties. And obviously whilst I've been here as well, I've been involved with the Society of Hospital Pharmacists of Australia and obviously UQ. So it's all basically a journey about how you end up here and all the things that are available or not available, I suppose. And then in terms of visas, I came on a working holiday visa to see what it was like. And then from that way on, I was sponsored by the hospital I work at to stay here. And then I became a permanent resident by being a profession in demand, and then I've been a citizen since 2014. Right, so Allan's already covered this, so thankfully I don't have to say an awful lot, but basically if your primary undergraduate degree was in Canada, the UK, Ireland, or the USA, then you're eligible for this competency stream. It costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time to get all your paperwork together. So I did it after I'd been registered for 5 years and had to scramble through finding my degree transcripts. Allan mentioned the first aid certificate and the letter of good standing, various different referee reports. I seem to remember having to have a number of different criminal record checks, including with Interpol, which was somewhat exciting, and the competency assessment, which Allan has done a really good review of. I agree, I think it very much is a test of how quickly you can open a book, and I intentionally used the Australian Medicines Handbook as opposed to using the BNF, which is the British counterpart, because I wanted to be familiar with the AMH for work, but definitely it's a different layout and it's a different system, and when you don't realise how much of your practice is reliant on your understanding of where things are in certain textbooks. So that was a bit of a challenge. And I particularly enjoyed the part where I had to write the letter to counsel somebody. Allan mentioned his was on methotrexate. Mine was on a weaning dose of steroids and warfarin and ciprofloxacin, I think. In terms of supervised practice, I got 4 out of 4 weeks, but I came over to Australia just after they had changed the reciprocal arrangement. So up until me coming over, you could just come over for 4 weeks, work with no exams and register, whereas this competency assessment came in mid-2007. And I had to have an interview with a member of the pharmacy board to decide how many hours of supervised practice I had to do, which I was really nervous about. And then when I got there, it was a conversation with a director of pharmacy from a local hospital who was on the pharmacy board, who was Irish. And so he was just like, yeah, sure, no worries, we'll just give you 4 weeks, you'll be fine. But I understand that there is that difference, and some people will be assessed as needing potentially more. For my supervised practice, I worked in community pharmacy, which was just easy for me to get at the time. It was definitely experience for somebody who hadn't worked really in community pharmacy prior to that, but it was definitely essential because of the pharmaceutical benefits scheme here, which is all about eligibility for medications and restricted indications, which I probably wouldn't have had a thorough understanding of if I hadn't have worked in community. After that, you undertake your registration assessment, which is a law and ethics exam, and I had a viva as well, and there you're able to register. So I worked out that I probably spent about $6,000 on this, which would have been about £3,000 at the time. And I did most of my eligibility work I did prior to coming to Australia, but I actually set my competency assessment whilst I was in Brisbane, just because it was more convenient for me, and then worked around that. Probably the thing that I had to do, and I don't know if Allan had to do, but I had to sit an English language exam again for this. So I had to do an international English language test, which was an eye-opener in itself. Some may say that if you're from Yorkshire, you need that anyway, but I dispute that claim. So that's how I registered. And then I thought I'd sort of talking about the things that are different and things that I have reflected on my practice. Now, when I came here, I wrote like a journal of sorts, just because I knew there were some friends back in the UK who were keen to come over. So this next few slides reflect on what I noticed at the time. So it's like my writings or musings from 13 years ago, but also I'm able to sort of reflect on it more maturely in this perspective of having worked here for a while now and still being networked to, within colleagues in the UK as well. So one of the differences between working in the UK and working in Australia from my perspective, which is worth pointing out, none of these will be criticisms as such. Everyone has positives and negatives about the different systems. It's just what I noticed as being a bit different. So the upsides really, and I split this into 2 columns, because one is kind of the upside of being a British pharmacist in Australia, and the other is just the upsides of being a pharmacist in Australia. So what I would say is that really having worked in the NHS gave me an immense amount of credibility when I came to Australia. It was really regarded as a major bonus that I had worked there, and particularly that I had done a residency, and that's become particularly of importance in the last few years in Australia, which has taken off its own residency program. I'm able to reflect on that, shape how we structure our hospitals' residency curriculum, but also give advice to those candidates who are going through it. But in terms of how I was perceived by my pharmacy peers and my multidisciplinary colleagues, being an NHS pharmacist was a definite bonus. Similarly, when I came to Australia, having a postgraduate qualification was quite rare amongst pharmacists, and so that meant that I stood out automatically, hopefully in a good way. But realistically, it meant I had some sort of obviously I had qualifications to back myself up, and that meant I was able, and I also had that experience to go with it as well. And I think it is changing now in Australia. Certainly more people are getting postgraduate qualifications, but it's not necessarily as required as it used to be in the NHS, for example. So when I was a band 6, the only way you were going to get a band 7 job was if you had a postgraduate diploma of some description, and anything after that was reliant really on having you proven yourself through various different sort of like standings. When I first came here, I was regarded as being a bit different because I like to write in medical notes, and my approach to practice was probably a little bit different from some of my colleagues. And I think that it's take into account that it could just also be where I work and the different people I work with. So I wouldn't want it to be a broad reflection on Australian practice as a whole, but I found that being more proactive and having interventions with prescribers at the point of prescribing was quite unique, and it wasn't as commonly done then as perhaps it is now, but certainly it wasn't as commonly done then as it was as the system that I had left behind in the UK. This is a bit cheeky, I suppose, but really having worked somewhere that was a bit more advanced in certain areas, when you're able to bring across ideas and experiences and transpose them into different clinical settings, then all of a sudden you become an innovator and you get some ticks in that box. But it's quite helpful to be able to say things like, oh, I've worked in this kind of system before and this worked really well, or this didn't work really well, or actually, well, why don't we use this? So things like using the ClinCats, I don't know what that's called in the UK now, it used to be the GLF. That was, lots of things have been moved across from the UK to Australia and adopted as practice here, and also being familiar with them already, or taking aspects of my practice and transposing it over here meant that I was able to sort of advance scope to a certain extent a lot easier, with a bit more comfort than perhaps some of my colleagues. And then I've included this as a positive, but I guess some people might think of it as negative, but pharmacy is a really small world. And I work now with somebody whose best friend from university was my clinical director when I was a pre-reg. My PhD supervisor is somebody who was actually my course director when I was at Nottingham, and one of the guys I used to work with actually used to work in a hospital I used to work at in the UK. It's an incredibly small world, and that's a really positive thing, and it certainly shows the benefits of networking and being connected, both at a local, national and international level, if that's what you're into. But it also shows that things like a network really support you and give you opportunities that perhaps you might struggle to find otherwise. In terms of the practice and the differences in Australia, so the upside's really the variety. Like, I can't explain the difference in stuff that I have seen here compared to what I'd worked in the UK, and I'd worked in a similar sized hospital with a similar range of services in terms of it being a tertiary centre. So just the fact that hospitals accept and manage lots of different complex cases, and the weird and wonderful things that you get here are just extreme. So, you know, I've managed a shark bite, I've managed various snake bites, and I can't say I would have done that in the UK, as well as all the usual sort of traumas and farming accident type things, but the things that just wouldn't necessarily come across in the UK routinely. The standard of national clinical guidelines in Australia is very high, so we tend to use something called the therapeutic guidelines, and that's used quite commonly for empirical prescribing, which is, in my line of work in emergency, is really important, but it's accepted and it's utilised and it's fairly freely accessible, which makes life a lot easier, and it's pretty good to have everybody on the same standard. In certain aspects of practice, there are some significant international leaders in Australia, which is really inspiring to work alongside and potentially, hopefully one day be part of, but particular critical care. So ICU in Australia is a very established specialty that is regarded very highly on an international level, and similarly in emergency medicine. Like Allan alluded to, telehealth and e-medicine have really taken off, particularly in a country that is as large as Australia, and that's really shown its worth in the current COVID climate, but it's not uncommon really here for you to have a specialist based in Brisbane speaking to a patient who's out in the bush somewhere around Emerald somewhere and having their reviews that way. Something that I really like about working in Australia is a can-do attitude. So if you work here and you think you can see a gap in the service, or you want to fix something, change something, try something different, usually if you approach it in the right way, you'll get lots of yeses and yes, give it a shot, let's see how you go, providing you're able to put some metrics around it and evaluate it appropriately. And that's a really positive thing. Similarly, the Hospital Pharmacists Association here, so that's the Society of Hospital Pharmacists Australia, they are a really great society that represents hospital pharmacists, obviously, and they have a really big presence in their teaching capacity, supporting people's continuing education, and also they coordinate things like advancing practice portfolios and the residency programs, and that's a really positive thing to have here, and I'm quite proud to be sort of had taken advantage of and worked with. And then I guess the things that everybody thinks about Australians' upsides, like the lifestyle here is immense. The weather is lovely, although it's a bit consistent in the sense it's either sunny and hot and humid or sunny and a bit cold. At least that's Queensland anyway. I think it's a bit different if you live down south. And it's very much geared to an outdoor lifestyle and sort of families, which is really important for me now, although I appreciate it would be a bit different for you guys. And then in terms of work-life balance, I would say that most people here enjoy a really good work-life balance. There isn't the big push for 24-hour extended hours services yet. I'm a bit of an anomaly, so it's currently midnight here, and I've just finished work about an hour ago. But that's because of where I work and the service we chose to provide. But most people will do an 8 till 5 job, Monday to Friday with intermittent weekends in hospital, as opposed to potentially a more extended roster that you may be used to wherever you are. Excuse me. So the downsides, well, apart from the fact that everything here tries to kill you, I really think that Australia, when I first came here, I thought Australia had a massive amount of catching up to do, and that particularly was in relation to the utilisation of technicians. It was really disheartening when I started and I worked in a dispensary that was staffed fully by pharmacists who were dispensing and checking everything, and the technicians or assistants role was pretty much restricted to purchasing or to ward stock management. So I've worked with a cohort of some amazing ward and clinical technicians, and they just don't exist here. There isn't the scope of practice built for them here, and there isn't the qualification pathway for them, which is a real shame. Sort of related to that, I found when I first started a definite clinical hierarchy and a very medical model of care, where pharmacists, nurses and allied health professionals were very much on the periphery of practice. That's changing now, but what it meant was that when you'd come from a background of kind of being very much part of the multidisciplinary team, regarded as a clinician in your own right, and having, you know, prescribing rights, to come somewhere where you were regarded as kind of like an added bonus but not a necessity, was a real challenge for me, and I found that really difficult. And it meant that particularly when I was trying to start off an advanced role, which is what part of my game plan, I guess, was that it was very difficult because I had to kind of explain what a pharmacist did, what we could offer right from the very foundations, as opposed to having any kind of understanding of what we could offer from the doctors to start with. I think that depends very much on where you work, both in terms of where you work inside your sphere of practice, as in terms of a specialty or community versus hospital, and also potentially what experience your doctors and nurses have had of pharmacists in the past. So that could be their previous experience overseas or any previous experience locally. I think professional advocacy is a challenge internationally for pharmacists, but there's a definite gap in Australia whereby there isn't really a representative body for us at all. So I left behind obviously the Pharmaceutical Society, which has its detractors potentially, but there was definitely a voice there for pharmacists that represented or attempted to represent most members of the profession. And here, the main people who seem to get consulted and asked for comment in the media is the Guild of Pharmacy, or the Pharmacy Guild, and that is a representative of pharmacy community pharmacy owners, and therefore it is arguably not necessarily representative as a profession across the board. And I think that's led to a less than fabulous public perception of the profession, to be honest. I appreciate that this may be contentious, I suppose, but when I was in the UK, and I'm happy for people to correct me, certainly if you said to somebody, oh, I'm a pharmacist, people understood what that meant. They understood what you offered, the team, what that meant for patients. Patients understood and the public understood. Whereas here, there's still that whole, you're a chemist, you sell perfume perception. And I think that there is a real risk in Australia that by following a path of like the discount chemists and the discount pharmacies, that we missed the opportunity to be seen as a professional on the high street, which is a real plus for the UK in particular. I reflect on is that in the UK, the community pharmacists had really established themselves as an accessible health professional who you could see without an appointment, who had their own spectrum of practice and specialty, which seems to have fallen through the gaps a little bit here, unfortunately. And then in terms of geography, Allan talked about this. So I live in Brisbane and my family live in North Yorkshire, and that is the best transit time you'll get is 24 hours. The time difference is, I think it's 9 hours at the minute, I can't remember, sorry. And it just is a massive challenge. And whilst you're a long way away from this in terms of your lives, potentially, it's a real challenge with little kids. And I know that my mum and dad find it really difficult that we're all the way over here. And with the COVID situation, I think it's going to be difficult to anticipate when that will ever resolve, to be honest. So that is a real issue. And just being away from people who can understand what you're saying, but that shared background can be a real challenge. So things like, do you remember this on TV when I was a kid? And no, they don't. And that sort of shared history can be a bit of a misstep on occasion. You miss that a bit. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are some challenges and things to negotiate. So we've talked about the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. I thought it was a really great idea when I started here. It means that medicines can't be necessarily prescribed for patients who it's not appropriately indicated for. The problem is that sometimes there are medications that should be indicated for something that are not covered by the PBS, and that is an issue. Medication differences, Allan referred to, he's got a much stricter formulary than us, but just things that the biggest issue here, I think, is that Australia and to an extent New Zealand, we have a much smaller population than the UK or America and Canada, and that means that various drug companies don't bother to license their products here, and so certain things aren't available, and that can be a real challenge when you've obviously grown up in a situation where you're expecting certain therapies to be prescribed and they're not, and you're not familiar with them. So the best example I had was when we had a patient who came in with like a GI bleed, and it was very much like, oh yeah, we'll get some terlipressin, and it's not available in Australia. And then similarly to that, shortages. And I know it's an issue worldwide, and particularly with COVID, there's the critical care drug issue, but drug shortages here are a real issue. There aren't multiple suppliers and there aren't multiple manufacturers, and so that means that sometimes things can go out of stock quite quickly that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate, that can cause a significant problem. Rural and remote practice, that's an issue with both geography. It takes a long time to transfer drugs around your state when your state, it's a 3-hour flight from one end of the state to the other. But also lone practitioners there, and how those regional hospitals and centres are set up with only like one pharmacist on staff, a visiting doctor, or it's run by nurses, and the challenges that can sometimes create. And then our population in Australia is quite diverse, and there's some obvious disparities in that. So obviously everyone will have been following the Black Lives Matter campaign. Well, in Australia, there's quite a significant issue with health disparity between Indigenous Australians and sort of white Australians. So much so we have a Closing the Gap scheme to try and address that. And what I found really challenging was that I didn't really understand that properly when I started, and there wasn't even though I went looking for it, I couldn't find anything to explain how to address this. So the fact that Indigenous Australians approach their health in a very different way from how white people approach their health. So we think about kidneys as filters, they think about it as a much more sort of natural analogy that they would use. And I would have appreciated some help in how to talk to people appropriately in a way that would actually mean that I actually was adding value to their care, rather than just sort of regurgitating a more conventional way of educating them. Does that make sense? Inconsistencies in service, I think, is an issue. There's still some hospitals here that don't have consistent services across all clinical areas, and that can be a challenge because you're trying to move things forward in one area and you aren't necessarily able to take the whole of the profession across with you. Further education that's geared towards pharmacists can be a challenge. So I mentioned before that I had to do one of my interests by being an overseas student back in the UK, and that's because it wasn't available in Australia. And I guess rose-tinted glasses, by which I mean, so sometimes it's really good that you've got some experience elsewhere, but that can sometimes mean that you look back with more than a favourable perception. And I've had a few of my friends who've come from the UK, worked over here, and then gone back because they didn't like how they were seen or working here, which is a real shame, because really you're better off, I think, addressing it and using that and overcoming that challenge and working to work with the rest of the profession to move things forward, I suppose, if that's where if you see there's a gap there. But realistically, there's not really nothing is unsurmountable, if that makes sense. And I guess the thing that I find a massive challenge, and I don't know if the others find this, but having an accent can sometimes be a real problem, particularly with certain words that you use a lot. So vitamins and vitamins can be a real challenge. And wearing a mask means that people aren't necessarily able to lip read at the moment, which can be a difficulty. So I guess that's the things that I reflected on in my time here. I hope some of my comments made sense. Realistically, I think that the best thing to think about is that your degree and our profession of pharmacy allow us to move on wherever we want, really. You can go anywhere and you can do anything, and I think that a positive attitude will make a massive difference. And take the good things that you've got and appreciate the good things that you go to and make it work and make a difference, rather than probably focusing on some of the things that might not quite work out. If you have a can-do attitude, you'll do it. These are some of the websites that we talked about. So there's a Pharmacy Council and the board, IELTS in case you need to prove you can speak your own language, and then that's the Home Affairs website for you to access for your visa requirements. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And again, I'm sorry, you've done well to overcome all the English language barriers that we put in front of you. Now, do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, Ryan?
I can't see Ryan's.
I think he's probably just going to type it into the box. I can read it out for you if you...
You're right, I'll stop sharing. There you go.
Perfect.
I have a standing joke. People will say to me, I can't understand your English. And I say, well, it's English. Yours is Australian.
Yes, I think we're probably not quite as proper. We try.
Was it challenging to find accommodation here and dealing with living costs? No, because I moved in with my boyfriend. But actually, it's worth saying, actually, people will often tell you that the cost of living in Australia is a lot cheaper. But I don't think that's necessarily true. So like, if you converted my wage back into pounds, it looks really, really good. But then also my houses probably cost a bit more money comparatively, and the cost of various like groceries and things like that is commensurate. So I wouldn't necessarily say it is cheaper. Yes, notes get UK boyfriend, you know. But yeah, I think, but no, it wasn't particularly a challenge. The biggest challenge I found, if I'm honest, is that you get paid in fortnightly here. And in the UK you get paid monthly, and that was really odd, to the point where I found I had money left over because I was so used to budgeting for a month rather than a fortnight. It's a good thing. Was the pay much different? So was the pay much different between the UK and Australia? I would be very careful here, I think. So in Queensland, the hospital pharmacists are paid really well compared to the rest of the country, is my understanding. Community pharmacy, I don't think is paid very well here from what I can see. My husband's a community pharmacist. And I don't think it is paid as well. I think you went pound for pound, I'm paid a lot better here. But like I said, cost of living is a bigger issue. Yes.
We've got
So, there's lots of questions. So I've got Camille has asked, when moving abroad with British qualifications, is it required or does it help in application to have a year of pre-reg work experience in the UK? Yes, it is, because you'll be a pharmacist. So when you come over, you've got a pharmacist, you'll have a letter of good standing, you've got that experience that we talked about. So if you can get it, I definitely have it, unless there's a reason for you to come over unqualified. Or unregistered, I should say, sorry.
Well, I know I have a question. So you mentioned the clinical hierarchy over here being a little bit more skewed towards the medical profession. Did you have any kind of top tips for what you find is a really good way to start that kind of discussion with the doctors that's worked for you a lot of the time, or is it just a case by case?
I think it's got to be case by case. Now, I'm quite fortunate in the sense that I don't know why this is, but emergency seems to attract, in Australia anyway, it seems to attract British doctors and nurses. So there's a lot of kind of like attracts like, and they're just used to you. But to begin with, I think it was a bit of a challenge, and you have to kind of be mindful of that when you don't go in all guns blazing, I think. And I just think you start by being appropriately respectful, as you would do anyway, and then making sensible suggestions and proving your worth from that way around. It's quite enlightening in a way, because you can't trade off this perception of what a pharmacist is. You've got to prove your worth first, and I think that can only be a good thing, really, because you're showing how valuable a pharmacist is as part of the team, and you're also establishing yourself. But yeah, just be respectful, and I guess a bit of personality never hurts. I think I trade off that quite a lot, if I'm honest. And I think that you just are respectful and appropriate, and don't be and don't kind of go in with that kind of like, I know it all attitude, probably, which you wouldn't do anyway, would you? I mean, that's just daft. But yeah.
Thank you. Now, if we don't have any other questions at the moment, I know it's very late at night and you've just finished work, so we might move on. And then if anyone has any questions, would you be happy for us to collate them and email them through in the next couple of days?
Yeah, I might stay for a little bit, because I'm interested to see what the reverse perception from Kimberley is, actually.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so next up we have Kimberley.
Just one really quick thing that I wanted to throw in. Despite our close geographical association with Australia, New Zealand doesn't have a single animal that can hurt you. Just saying.
But we've got really nice beaches that make up for the deadly animals.
We have great beaches, particularly in Northland, are stunning. And
a lot of the deadly animals live on the beach.
I'm trying here, I'm trying. We don't want to turn everyone off. So Kimberley, did you want to start sharing your screen and jump into your presentation? Yeah. So Kimberley is our New Zealand to UK.
Just bear with me, it'll probably go horribly wrong now.
No, I have all the faith in the world. Perfect.
Oh, first time, look at that. So, as has already been said, I am a Kiwi now living in the UK, and you can probably hear that most of my accent is actually gone until I hit on particular vowels, which you might pick up on the way. But I'll just start with a bit of background information on myself and how I managed to end up in the UK. I actually grew up in quite a small town in New Zealand called Oamaru, which is about an hour north of Dunedin and the University of Otago. But I did decide at quite a young age that I wanted to be a pharmacist. I was only 13 at the time. And at that time, the one and only pharmacy school in New Zealand was at Otago, so that was an added bonus. At the same time, I always wanted to travel, and that was my dad's fault, because he travelled around Europe in the 60s. He was quite a bit older than my mum. There was a 22-year age gap, and before the big OE was even a thing, he went around Europe, and when he came back to Oamaru, it was a really big deal. He was in the newspaper, and big celebrations that someone had actually done something like that. he used to tell us how it took 6 weeks to get to the UK on the boat, and how he and his mates cycled around the UK in the few years that he was here. I basically wanted to follow in his footsteps. So I knew I wanted to be a pharmacist. I knew I wanted to travel. So I put together a life plan, I guess you could say, to be able to do that. So my plan, just quickly, was to become a pharmacist in New Zealand, move to the UK, register there, do some locum work, fund my travel around Europe, and then after a few years I could move back home. I knew at the time that I qualified for an ancestry visa, which I'll talk about a bit later on, but that would give me 5 years to do the travelling that I wanted to do, so it was plenty of time. So in 2004, I graduated from Otago with my Bachelor of Pharmacy. I completed my intern year, or pre-registration year for the British people listening, at a small independent community pharmacy in Christchurch. So I moved to Christchurch, and by the end of 2005 I was registered as a pharmacist and ready to start working as a fully qualified pharmacist. And it was at that point that my plan started to unravel a little bit. So while I was going through university, the rules around reciprocal registration in the UK was that you could work for a month under supervision and then you would be registered. So for a lot of Kiwis and Aussies, they could go to the UK on like a 2-year work visa. They could locum around and fund their travelling that way, and then they'd come home when their visa expired. And that a lot of people did that. So at this point, 2006, 6 months into my first year of registration, the UK changed the rules on me. So prior to doing that 1 month under supervision, you had to have been qualified for a full year in your country of origin. So, and the rules changed 6 months into my first year. The new way that they came up with was expensive. It would take me 2 years to complete it. So I sort of put that on a back burner for a little bit. And at the end of 2006, I actually bought a house in Christchurch, and my dad passed away. So things were sort of changing a lot. The plan then was that I would still go travelling, but I'd rent out my house and I'd have somewhere to come back to after my travels. But I wasn't quite ready to move at that time. So I was still working in Christchurch in community pharmacy. And in early 2008, the UK started talking about scrapping the ancestry visa. So that gave me a little bit of a kick. And July 2008, I was on my way to the UK. So with the new way of registering in the UK, I'd basically written it off because it was 2 years. It was going to cut into my travelling that I really wanted to do far too much. And I'd written it off as an option completely. So I didn't register as a pharmacist straight away. I looked into what I could do instead to work, so I could still do my travelling. And I eventually settled on working as a locum pharmacy technician. So before I'd left, I'd signed up to a couple of locum agencies. I completed all the paperwork, proved my identity, proved that I was immune to particular diseases. I had to have a BCG vaccine because it's not routinely given in New Zealand. And before I left, I actually had my first locum job to start just a week after landing in London. So off I go to London. I would say at this point, though, that option isn't really viable anymore. So when I did this in 2008, pharmacy technicians didn't have to be registered in the UK. They still had to do a course and everything, but overseas qualified pharmacists could just get a job as a technician. I was having a look at the GPHC website the other day, and while you can still do it, you actually have to do the pharmacy technician course, regardless of what your qualifications are anywhere else, and that's 2 years anyway. As an overseas qualified pharmacist, you get let off a bit of the work experience part of registering as a technician, but you don't get let off the actual course itself. So it may not be an option for some of you anymore. Other options that you could look at if you wanted to do it this way, I've got friends that work in industry. I've got friends that eventually did the conversion course with me that worked in industry before they did the course. So that's a good place to start. Or also if you can just work as an assistant either in community or hospital, and still get some experience in a pharmacy environment. So as mentioned before, now as a quick disclaimer, I'm not an immigration expert, so you will have to get your do a little bit of research around your own personal circumstances and what visas or options are going to be right for you. But I qualify for an ancestry visa, which is available to people from Commonwealth countries who have a grandparent that was born in the UK. My dad's mum was born here, so that made me eligible. And it's valid for 5 years and it's renewable. So once you get to the end of that initial 5 years, if you're not ready to go home, you can renew it. And the other option after 5 years, if you've been living in the UK all that time and haven't left for more than 90 days at any one point during that 5 years, you can actually apply then for indefinite leave to remain. But granted, that option won't be available to all of you. And I understand if one of your parents is British, you can actually potentially be eligible for British citizenship anyway, which might make it easier. But I'm not an immigration expert, so do make sure you do a bit of research into what's right for you. There is a couple of websites there I've listed there. The government website has all the information about visas and everything. The GPHC website, obviously everything you'll need for doing your conversion. So obviously I've now done the conversion course, so I wouldn't be here talking to you. So what happened? The first job I got as a locum was at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, which is in Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, and it's also the only job I had as a locum pharmacy technician. On my first day there, I met the man who's now my husband, and after working as a locum for a little over a year, I actually took a permanent job there because he was there and it just made sense at the time. So I took a permanent post as the lead technician in the procurement and distribution part of the hospital, where I got a lot of experience out of that actually, and I learned a lot of, I got a lot of invaluable knowledge about supply chain and all those other things that some pharmacists don't always think about when they're on the wards. So in 2011, I took just over 3 months out to travel around Europe. But some of you, it's already been alluded to in the first presentation by Allan in 2011, of course, the Christchurch earthquake hit. And of course, I still had my house in Christchurch. Things got a bit hairy and my future sort of just changed what I was going to do. So I did my travels around Europe. I did 3 months, loved it, would recommend it to everyone. But my house back home was damaged in the earthquake, and it took 4 years, but eventually they decided it was repairable. So I got an insurance payout. All the money I'd put into the house, I suddenly got back, which actually meant that I could finally actually afford to do the conversion course because it is expensive. So in 2015, after 7 years in the UK, I finally got myself sorted to do the conversion course. So there's 3 steps that you need to take to register over here. The first one is the Overseas Pharmacist Assessment Programme, or the OSPAP course, which takes a year. The second is pre-registration year, which is, I'll talk about all these things a bit later on. And then the third thing is the pre-registration exam as well. So the OSPAP course, it is a postgraduate diploma, so it is offered through universities, currently 5, although I'm reliably informed that Kingston aren't going to be offering it anymore. So again, the GPHC website's got a lot of information on which universities offer the course. So you come out the end with a postgraduate diploma. The thing that I found a bit weird was you actually apply to the GPHC and they assess how eligible you are to sit the course. So that involves sending in all your documents, your ID, transcripts. They wanted a copy of the curriculum of my original degree in Otago. But like Elizabeth, I had to sit the IELTS test to prove that I could speak English, despite coming from an English-speaking country, where English is one of the official languages, and and having a degree that was taught and examined in English. I still had to sit the IELTS test. So the IELTS test, I can't remember how much it was now, it's 50 or 150 pounds. Just to apply to the GPHC is 687 pounds. And then each university has its own university fees on top of that. So it's not a cheap option. I had a look again at all the universities' websites the other day when I was putting this presentation together. You're looking at in excess of £10,000. The average is probably around £12,000 for a year at university. Each university offers something different, so it's a good idea to look and find what fits in with you. So I personally chose Brighton, and the reason for that was it does say on their website that they're the most flexible course. I don't know what the other courses are like, so I can't confirm or deny that, but at Brighton they had actual face-to-face classes were only 2 days a week, so they were on Thursday and Friday. And that was guaranteed. We had a clinical placement that they couldn't guarantee was a Thursday or a Friday, so I think I was out for 1 day, which I just took annual leave from. But obviously the 2 days at university meant I could still work part-time to be able to pay for living costs. We had a mortgage at the time as well, and I just wouldn't have been able to afford to go to university for a year if I had not been able to also work part-time. So I know some of the other universities do contact days where it's not 5 days a week, but I'm not sure which days they have or how many days of the week they do have contact time. I did look at the University of Hertfordshire, and at the time they had contact time, but it was on 3 days a week. So it was just a difference between the two. The courses are all accredited by the GPHC, so they're all teaching you the same thing, but how they go about that is different between each university. So with Brighton, also the fees that I paid, so the £12,000 that I paid in university fees, actually also they provided the textbooks for me, so I didn't have to go around and hunt all of those down as well. So I started my OSPAP course in September 2016, which happened to be just 3 weeks after my wedding, and graduated the following July at the top of my class, the only one to achieve a distinction grade that year. So that was my big achievement. So the classes that I took, so as I mentioned, we had class on Thursday and Friday. Thursday was lectures, normally only 2. And the Friday was a full day of more sort of practical based learning. So a few OSCEs, role playing sort of scenarios. We had a first aid team in 1 week, and all that's more sort of practical, learning how to read a blood pressure and all that sort of, those sorts of skills that you might need. Yeah, so it's a year's course, and at the end of it you come out with your postgraduate diploma. So following on from that, you then move on to your pre-registration year or intern year, if people are still using that terminology. It's exactly the same as what the UK qualified pharmacists do. You can do it in the community, you can do it in the hospital, you can do it in the industry. You can now do it in a GP surgery as a GP pharmacist, or with a CCG, or a combination. So tend to find more often that hospitals might have a placement with a CCG or a placement in industry. I know the hospital I work at certainly has a 6-month placement with the CCG. So you do 6 months in the hospital and 6 months in CCG. I know other places have industry placements. I'm not too familiar with the GP placements because they are very new, as in, I think last year was the first year that they'd offered them. You do have to be aware of the deadlines for applications. So particularly with hospital, if you want to do a hospital pre-reg, so the pre-registration year starts sort of August. In fact, our pre-regs are starting tomorrow. But the pre-regs that are starting tomorrow applied last year, probably June, July, I think. And they apply through a system called, I think it's called Oriel. And it sort of places the pre-regs. It will, I think there might be tests involved. I'm not fully familiar with it because I actually did my pre-reg in community. But hospital is an option, but the deadline for, if you wanted to start a pre-reg, say next year, you're too late now because the next year's pre-regs have already got their placements. So it is quite a long way in advance that you need to apply. If you want to go into community pre-reg, it's not quite as strict. I didn't apply for community pre-regs until I was sort of halfway through my OSPAP course. That was a bit late, but I did get there in the end. And then at the end of June, there's a written exam, a calculations paper in the morning, clinical knowledge paper in the afternoon, and then a month later you get your results. And as I said, it's exactly the same as what the UK qualified pharmacists are doing. So there's a lot of information out there around what to expect. And during your pre-reg, you'll get a lot of information and preparation for the exam going through that year as well. So what's next? So once you've done your OSPAP course, you've done your pre-reg year, you've passed your pre-reg exam, you then have to apply to join the register. So you need all your documents again. You need a letter of good standing from your country of origin again. So I think by this point, I needed a letter of good standing when I applied to do the OSPAP, when I applied for the pre-reg year, and again when I applied to join the register. And then you've obviously got another fee to pay. And then you can go off and work as a pharmacist. So I am currently working in hospital. In New Zealand, I actually worked in community and I absolutely loved it. When I came here, obviously I did my technician as a locum in hospital, which was great. I learned a lot. But when it came to my pre-registration year, I thought, I don't want to do it in hospital. I want to get a feel for what community is like, because I had loved it so much in New Zealand that I thought maybe it would be the same over here and I'd move into community pharmacy. But I would say I didn't enjoy it as much over here. I didn't find, other people may have a completely different experience. In New Zealand, I really found that the doctors were quite approachable. You could always get hold of one if you needed to. And I find that's a struggle over here to get through to speak to the actual prescriber if something's wrong with the prescription. Or in New Zealand, I used to ring the GP surgery, say who I was, where I was calling from, can I speak to Dr. So-and-so? And I'd literally be put through to the doctor unless there was any reason I couldn't be straight away. Over here, they'll take a message, the doctor will call you back. Doesn't matter if the prescription is urgent. There always seems to be a delay, which it just meant I didn't enjoy the experience so much. I didn't feel like I was part of a team as much, perhaps, as I did back home in New Zealand. In the hospital now, I actually I'm a band 7 pharmacist, and I'm currently working my way through my next postgraduate diploma, which if you work in hospital over here, you will need to do as well. But I'm currently working in the women's and children's area, pediatrics, postnatal, neonatal intensive care. And the doctors there are really lovely and really approachable, and you really do feel like you're part of a team. So much so that actually this is the speciality that I have now decided that I want to do, which I would have never found out had I stayed in New Zealand and stayed in community pharmacy. The health system over here is quite similar to New Zealand. I know Allan alluded to Pharmac in their funding requirements. It's not quite that strict over here. There's a lot more choice. But the way prescriptions are paid for, the way the public pays for prescriptions is quite similar. And yeah, but overall, obviously speak the language. I've lost my accent. So overall, I found it quite similar. I don't regret moving here. Obviously, I now have a British husband and I had a little girl last year. So my family is over here now. But as the others have said, it's a long way to go home. And for me, minimum 30 hours generally on a airplane or multiple airplanes, because you can't really go all that way on just one. So yeah, it's been an experience. I don't regret it at all, but I would still probably move home pretty quickly if I could. I think the hardest thing I find over here is I find the work-life balance back home I felt was probably a bit better. But that doesn't mean I don't do a lot of stuff over here and I don't go traveling when I want to, and a bit harder now with the family, but it's a lot easier to travel to Europe or go to America for a long weekend or over to Europe for a short break, whereas those options aren't so readily available in New Zealand. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. Feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you so much, Kimberley. So yes, we'll move on to some questions from the floor. Just pull up the chat box. Oh, you're very onto it, Ryan. Off you go. I'm assuming he's just typing out.
Oh, let's hope it's not too long. If you're already a citizen of the UK, is the process any different? To be honest, I don't think it is, because it's based on where your qualification is from. So if you are eligible for citizenship because your parents or one of your parents was born here, but you have, say, a New Zealand or an Australian degree, you'd still have to go through the OSPAC process because your degree isn't a UK degree.
Anyone else got any questions? I know it's very late at night and very early in the morning for some people, so they may have forgotten how to, it was taking people a while to type out their questions. Yep. Off you go, Sebastian.
Hi. So Allan talked a little bit about how his student debt sort of travelled with him when he moved. But I was under the impression, for UK students at least, when you move abroad, the student debt is pretty much, it doesn't follow you, it stays in the UK with you. I'm wrong? Okay. Okay, fair enough. I was just wondering if it was the same for Kimberley and Elizabeth.
Can I go first, Kimberley, if that's more relevant to Sebastian?
You go ahead.
So I left the UK in 2007 and probably still owed, I can't remember, I think about 11 grand, I think, when I left. And you can opt to delay your repayments. And then, is it still a student loans company, Sebastian? Or am I really showing my age now?
It changed in about 2010, I think.
Oh, whoever it is,
Maybe.
you'll get screwed over the same anyway. So basically what happened is they take into account what you earn. So they want your pay slip, and then they decide what your your commensurate cost of living is. So they look and they say, well, you earn this much money, which is this many pounds, but we think it only costs this much money to live in Australia. So therefore you owe us this much money every month in repayments. So I end up paying back more because I lived in Australia and worked in Australia, because they thought it was cheaper to live here and I earned more money. And so I had to send a lot more money back. And then when you factor in the conversion factor and the commission and the rates and all the usual things that go with transferring money overseas, I ended up paying like a heap load. I think I paid an extra third back per instalment compared to living in Australia versus living in the UK. And in the end, I just decided it was just cheaper just to pay it all off in one lump, because yeah, that's worth knowing.
I think with the New Zealand student loan, obviously if you're still in New Zealand, the government give it to you interest free to try and keep you in the country. Once you move overseas, you start earning interest on that student loan. So you do need to bear that in mind as well. I think I had to pay, do you know what, I can't actually remember. I was still owed £40,000 when I left. And I had to pay a couple of £1,000 every 6 months or something. They didn't, I didn't have to send any documents. I had to tell them I was moving, basically, so they'd start charging me interest. And then they sort of tell you how much you have to pay back and how often, based on how much you still owe. I think that was right. They may have changed it since then. In the end, again, Christchurch earthquake hit. I pulled all that money out of the house and my student loan got paid off that way. But yeah, if you do come over, you will start accruing interest on your New Zealand student loan.
Thank you.
I know you've all kind of touched on this anyways, but is there one thing that you wish that you'd known before you moved, or one kind of top tip for what to do? Just a quick summary, and then I think we've got one more question from Ali. Sorry, I know it's one of those very general questions that you have to think about.
I'll start. I think for me, it was going backwards a bit in practice. Certainly in British Columbia, working in hospital, I had a lot more freedom in prescribing, altering, and stopping medications independently. And when I came to New Zealand, that was not a thing at all. And actually, I would echo what Elizabeth has said. I was a real outlier in making what they consider to be strong recommendations, I guess, to the medics. I think the culture here was very much, to kind of make a recommendation about what they could think about maybe doing if they felt it was right. And I was very much of, what you've prescribed is wrong, and I think you should do this. And that didn't always go over well. And I think those were the biggest changes. What I wish I had known kind of coming into it, I would have been a bit better prepared for that. All right, I'm going to call Elizabeth out then, since neither Elizabeth or Kim are saying it.
I guess mine doesn't necessarily work. I think that's a really good point, Alan. Thanks. That's a really good point, Alan, actually. But I think that I mean, in that situation, I think I got around it with humour. I think that kind of worked a bit, and I'm fairly sure that there's a few people who think I'm just this random British pharmacist, and that's just how she is. But it seems to work for me. The main thing I probably reflect on is, it's probably a bit personal, I guess, but what the heck, is that I've always kind of been an go hard or go home kind of person, and it's like, if you're going to do it properly, I don't bother. And that can be a bit difficult, in the sense that it can be difficult to find your feet here. And even though even though Australia is obviously a nation primarily made up of immigrants, like 23% of the people here were born overseas, it's still quite difficult to come here and start a new life here, because people, particularly in Brisbane, and I acknowledge that Brisbane is a bit different anyway in its demographic, but is in a sense that people seem to go to school here, make friends here, stay together forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And when you come as an outsider, it's actually quite difficult to kind of find a niche. And I reflect quite strongly that a lot of my friends are actually expats of various different countries who've all come and kind of stuck together like this coalescence of orphans who didn't go to the same school as everybody else and don't know the same sort of hangouts and things like that. And that's a bit of a challenge, because I've always been the kind of person who you could pick me up in the UK and put me down anywhere, like the Nottingham, London, Sheffield, Southampton, and really settled in really easily. And I found it a bit difficult here. That's probably my biggest thing. I wasn't expecting that, if I'm honest.
I would say, to be honest, I'm a researcher, so I like to research a lot of things so that they don't come up and surprise me in the end. But at the same time, you have to be flexible, particularly if you're going to locum. You need to be flexible about where you're going and when. I don't think, because New Zealand is quite similar to the UK, I didn't have any major culture shocks or anything like that. And because my family, obviously my dad's mum was born over here, I always sort of felt that connection anyway a little bit. So I didn't really get any major shocks when I came over here, apart from the fact that no one could understand me at the time. They can now, but at the time they questioned why I was asking for a pen instead of a pen. And it's yeah, but yeah, nothing major, too major at this end.
Okay, we have a question from Ali, and she's asked if anyone has any insight into the qualifications or requirements of other countries that are non-English speaking, so such as other European countries.
I looked that up just now because I wasn't entirely sure. But for New Zealand, you have to have graduated from a university level pharmacy degree, so a minimum 4-year pharmacy degree, and you had to have worked for 12 months out of the last 5 years in a quote unquote what they call a clinical role, but just I would assume that just means as a pharmacist. Then you put in your application with all of your documentation and proof of this for consideration, and if it passes that stage, you have to do what's called the CAPSI exam, which is a knowledge assessment of pharmaceutical sciences. So basically it's going right back to all of your pharmaceutical chemistry, pharmacology, physiology. See, that's 2 separate exams. And then you have to do the pharmacy law course. And then if you get through all of that, you basically apply to be a pharmacy intern. So then you would be at the same stage as any New Zealand pharmacy graduate who does their first year as an intern year before they qualify as a full pharmacist. And the challenge you would have with that would be finding a placement that would take you. So if you could find a community pharmacy or hospital position that would take you on as an intern, then you're in the same intern stream as everybody else.
Kimberley or Elizabeth, did you have anything to add to that one? If not, that's okay. No, all good. So our next question is for Allan. So would you know anything about the process for going to UK to Canada in terms of time it takes or tests to do?
I don't know specifically about the UK to Canada, but I am familiar with people who've gone from New Zealand to Canada, and it is actually quite a lengthy process. I know that they have to do a knowledge assessment exam, again, going back to medicinal chemistry and physiology. And then depending on the province that you go to, it's going to be different. Each province in Canada has its own licensing body with its own set of rules, but you would likely have to do the Pharmacy Examining Board of Canada exams, which are, when I did them, they were 3 days long. I don't know if they may have changed. And I think there's now a lengthy OSCE process in there, so like practical exam bit. But talking to most people, it can take up to a year to get licensed in Canada. So it's honestly it's a bit archaic, and I think it needs to be relooked at, but there's no real drive to do that, unfortunately.
Our next question is for Kimberley. So it's from Ashley, and she's asking if she's correct in thinking that an overseas qualification is the only thing needed as a requirement to apply for the OZPAP in the UK. Are there any academic requirements?
So just the English language proof that you can speak English. So either the IELTS test, or there are a few exemptions to the IELTS test, which are all listed on the GPHC website. To be honest, I can't remember how much experience, but there isn't anything else academically. You need to be registered as a pharmacist in your country of origin, though. So you need to have done your Bachelor of Pharmacy or whatever your country offers, and your pre-registration, and be on the register as a pharmacist before you move.
Okay, and that's all the questions that we've had sent through at this point. Unless anyone has any other burning questions that they cannot sleep without having answered, we might wrap it up here, especially given the time of day that it is for many people. 30 seconds. I think we'll wrap it up. So thank you so much. Yeah.
So I just see there's one question there from Joshua about, again, moving from New Zealand to Canada. Are there any specific postgrad courses that would set you up better than others? No, actually, I don't think anything is going to change in terms of how they treat you going through the various hoops to get licensed in Canada if you have extra postgrad courses. I mean, all the extra knowledge that you can gain will make it easier to, do the exams and whatnot that you have to do. But all of the requirements are going to be the same regardless of what your qualifications or education is, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you so much to the three of you for chatting to us all and sharing your experiences. I know that I have loved hearing your stories, and it's a really great place for all of us to start looking into moving countries if that's what people would like to do. Thank you so much to everyone that signed on, and if you're watching this on the recording, congrats for getting extra sleep on top of all of us. And yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there. So thank you so much to everyone, and we'll see you next time.
No worries. Good luck, everybody.
Good luck, everyone.